Bon, bonjour à tous. Je remercie les organisateurs pour d'avoir accepté mon proposition tardive de participer à cette réunion. Merci. Comme je ne veux pas massacrer la langue française, je vais continuer en anglais. Excusez-moi. Good morning to everyone. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's been some great days. I know that we don't have much time. Usually we don't, and usually I do not sympathize, and usually I don't read. But I try to keep it this quite dynamic and try to give you share a little bit some of the concerns I have with this issue. And when Hervé was presenting and telling the name of the table, the table ronde, excuse me, the mission de combat, and we've been talking about a lot of the combats regarding this. I was wondering that, yeah, I'll talk about the other side of the fight. Most of my actors here would be white actors fighting against some kind of racism. So we will get there to understand what we are talking about. I'll try to keep my presentations around three main points, topics. Okay, so the idea of what in what we call the late colonialism, so especially after Second World War, within the Portuguese Catholic Church and for the Portuguese political authorities meant the indigenous clergy. And Professor Jamal was discussing this morning about autochthonous, indigenous, native, and we will get to the discussions what this word really meant and how it was used in favor of the Portuguese ideological conceptions of the empire. Then the second part regarding the social and political impacts of having a black clergy and especially a black ecclesiastical hierarchy. And then next, close to this, the problem of the so-called the issue of the black bishop, which was a main issue yesterday I was trying to start a conversation regarding this, and then I think I'll have time to go there. So I just okay. So is this a short? Is really small. Okay, I realize that by now. Yeah, because it's impossible for me to read to the computer. So, but this is a short chronology. So, I usually have to face this kind of dilemmas when I'm presenting to a non-Portuguese audience. Some things regarding the Portuguese Empire. Some people are aware. Some people are well. They know that Portuguese Empire exists, but they don't know much more about that. So we're talking about the period would be between the establishment of Estado Novo, so the regime of Salazar's in 1932, to the Angola's. I'll be focused mainly in Angola, but Angola's independence and other Portuguese colonies in 1974, 75. Okay, so between them, you have the Concordat and the Missionary Agreement in 1940 that somehow would be used by the Portuguese church and the Portuguese state to say we have the stamp of approval by the Holy See. In 1941, the Missionary Statute gave the Catholic Church almost the exclusive monopoly over the indigenous education or the education over the indigenous population. We're talking about colonial times, so this is mainly theoretical. Okay, Protestants still have schools and were educating local populations. Then one of the events I'm talking about, the exiles of Angolan priests in Portugal, and the beginning of the independence war in 1961, and obviously Vatican II, which is quite important. The context is the late imperial experience. Okay, so we're talking about Portugal. This is one of the most striking piece of propaganda set by the Portuguese regime after the establishment or the end of the empire, in the sense that Portugal didn't have an empire. Portugal was a pluricontinental nation and a multiracial nation. Okay, and was one of the maps. This is the French version. There's also an English one, and also the Portuguese one, saying Portugal não é país pequeno. So Portugal is not a small country, and they decided to put the colonies or the overseas provinces, the correct term, over the map of Europe. Obviously, as the propaganda is amazing, right? And especially part of it over Soviet Union, who was the declared enemy of the regime because they were communists. Despite most of Africa at the time, the Portuguese Africa was not considered a missionary territory. So there was no prefectures or vicariates dependent on propaganda fide, especially after 1940, the Concordat and the Missionary Agreement. So the organization was dioceses, archdioceses like Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, was the same. So they were not dependent on propaganda, but they depended on the Secretariat of State of the Holy See, and especially the Congregation of the Extraordinary Ecclesiastical Affairs. So the problem was the nuncio, the Secretary of State, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and obviously Salazar's intervention. So there was no figure as the apostolic delegate there was in Belgium Congo, or for the British Eastern territories in Africa, or in Dakar, like Monsieur Lefebvre. There wasn't anyone like this. It was the same like having the nuncio in Paris and have the apostolic delegate in Marseille. Would not make sense, okay, because all the issues would pass through the nuncio, and was one of the important aspects. When the issue of the indigenous clergy, of the creation, the promotion of the indigenous clergy became more present and being pushed by international agendas, whether outside the Catholic world, but especially inside the Catholic world after the Second World War. Okay, we can also go back, but especially with the beginning of the decolonization moment in Asia, after the Evangelii Praeconis in 1961, we see inside the Catholic world the need to speed up, not only because the independents were arriving, but also, and was a long tradition, the Protestants were ahead of the process. And we've been, some of these communications pointed out some of these aspects. The Protestants were actually getting ahead of it. For the Portuguese, actually, the indigenous clergy was not the problem. Okay, yesterday, Giacomo Gaidini talked about the first Black bishop in the 16th century. In the 1950s and 1960s, it was used by the Portuguese church and by the Portuguese government to show how Portugal was not a racist country or a racist empire. They had the first bishop. Okay, 5 centuries ago, but that's okay. That's just kind of small details. Even the Spiritans, who was a French congregation, well established in Portugal, who has actually had almost the monopoly in the evangelization in Angola, they keep pushing the example of their first mixed race priest ordained in 1892 as an example. So these are the exceptions. because this is not common. So, but they keep using these small examples to show we're talking about propaganda first and foremost, not only for international organizations like the United Nations and the criticism coming from it, but also to the Holy See. I want to read this quotation by António Brásio. António Brásio was a Spiritan, one of the most famous missiologists of Portugal. He says that the problem of the Portuguese missionary personnel is neither of black priests nor European white or metropolitan priests, but of Portuguese and Catholic priests. The nationalism openly condemned by Benedict XV, someone pointed out the question of Benedict XV and the Maximo Illud in 1919, can be the nationalism that foreign missionaries bring to missionary lands under another flag, as well as the xenophobia, which is more or less latent, and which here and there are already being manifested among the native clergy themselves towards the white clergy, a racism of the worst kind, since it transposes into the church herself certain pagan errors and nourishes through a problem which of itself is totally foreign to her. Okay, so was obviously a clever way to turn around the problem. So the question was not how to indigenize the clergy, because the clergy in the Portuguese territories were already indigenous, because all of this was Portugal. So give an example. So if someone was born in Paris and decided to, okay, maybe France would not be a good example, but follow me, please. So it was born in Paris and become a priest in the south or in the east, they would not be considered as foreigner. Okay, he's French, right? Okay, forget all the regional divergences, please. So was really the same. But the problem was that these kind of arguments mainly considered that only those born in this part of the nation were indigenous to all of the rest of the nation. But obviously was a way to confront all of the accusations they've been facing. Another example is this man, Teodósio Clemente de Gouveia, that from 1946 to 1960 was, proudly from the Portuguese point of view, the only cardinal coming from Black Africa. Obviously, he was not a Black. He was born in Portugal, okay? He was a proudly defender of the Portuguese nationalism and the Portuguese civilizing mission. But his nomination as a cardinal, and because he was the Archbishop of Lourenço Marques, so in Mozambique, he technically was, in fact, the only cardinal of the Curia coming from the Black Africa, considered as geographically, okay, not as a concept of color, and was used proudly. So, and if we connect this image to this text, what we have is the idea that the indigenous is not regarding the color. So Portugal was being accused of being a racist regime, like usually next to the South Africa apartheid regime. So these were proofs used internationally to show, oh no, we are not racist. Mm. And the problem is not about color, because we have white priests, black priests, yellow priests, brown priests, priests of every possible colors. There was a part of this text that it has, we have priests of all colors of the rainbow, which is a very romantic way. But in the between the lines, we can see the structural racism of the regime. Um, other way to prove that the regime was not racist and was, in fact, a process of indigenization of the regime. These are only four men, okay? It's just there are more than. By the 1960s, there were around 50 to 60 black priests in Angola only, okay? So in the 1960, 1961, a group of Angolan priests were forced to exile in Portugal. And this was the open and the visible face of the problem of having an indigenous, here in the more close sense of the term. That man is Alexandre do Nascimento, who actually was the first, one of the first of a group of Angolan priests to be sent to Rome to study at the Gregoriana, which in the 1940s, late 1940s. Joaquim Pinto de Andrade, who actually was one of the founders of MPLA, so the movement for the independence of Angola, Manuel Mendes das Neves, who was at the time the Vicar General of, thank you, of Luanda. So the Archbishop of Luanda. So we are talking about men who had significant positions within the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And then Manuel Franklin da Costa, they are more, they're a group of 9, okay? But Manuel Franklin da Costa, that will become a bishop after the independence as Alexandre do Nascimento. This pointed out, and because I only have five minutes, I'll try to slowly try to conclude also. But I wanted to point it out, the problem of the black bishop, because is quite interesting and some quite silly sometimes. In the 1960s, despite the war began in Angola in 61, this is the part of the life of the Catholic Church in the Portuguese Africa, that you have a colonial church in the post-colonial Africa. Okay, so it's after 1960, especially the Catholic countries. So Belgium and France already almost finished its the decolonization by then. Portugal was the only main Catholic country who remained a colonial power. But the Catholic Church was facing problems in the new independent countries. The situations regarding Guinea, for instance, and the Touré regime's opposition to the church, the problems faced by Chitimbo. So obviously all of these issues concern the Portuguese church. But the Holy See were pressing. They needed to speed up the Africanization. And they proposed that Portugal should allow a black bishop. And the response of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to the nuncio, Maximilian von Fürstenberg, was an amazing diplomat, was saying, okay, we can think about it, but we should nominate as an auxiliary, obviously. Well, it's not the same thing that the Holy See did with French Africa in the 50s, but nominate him to the metropole. So a Portuguese bishop in Portugal will have a black auxiliary. Obviously, the nuncio said, no, no one would accept here that. The same happened in Africa. No bishop in Africa would accept a black auxiliary. Was only in 1970 that was allowed. Okay, the image is not very good, but this is Angola's episcopate in 1974 or 2. And over here, sorry, we have Eduardo André Mwaka, who was the first black bishop, auxiliary, yes, but of Luanda, who was the head of the Catholic Church. So it was a kind of a middle way between being a residential bishop and being a bishop of a land that doesn't matter to anyone. Okay, obviously he was very close to the power. Nevertheless, and I'm going to finish, a Puritan, a white Portuguese Puritan, who was being critic of the regime, and by then in 1970 was not even living in Portugal anymore. He was exiled in France, wrote to Muaka, they were friends, and said to Muaka that by accepting the nomination, he is not doing anything good for the cause of the church in Angola. Not the Portuguese church, not the Catholic church, but the church in Angola, because he accepted to be an auxiliary bishop under the colonial regime. Muaka will become the first residential bishop in 1973, so 1 year before the end of the regime. Part of the issue here is that the Catholic Church in Portugal was not, they transformed the problem of the race to a problem of nationalism and patriotism. The question was to know how faithful to their nation, and here in the plural, these men will be. So the group that I showed you before, some of them, so part of the beginning of the independence in Angola started in Joaquim Pinto Andrade's house. In 1962, he became an honorary president of the movement. So the church, what was facing there is, like happens in all colonial churches, the Catholic Church, but also in the Protestant, was what will come next. The problem was we will still be seen as as a remnant of colonialism. In 1977, we can see that the majority of the episcopate was Black. But in many other examples, the Belgian Congo only have a first residential bishop after the independence. So it's not only a question of the regime and the pressure of the Holy See, it's also a matter of the perceptions of those in charge of the church. And we cannot forget that most of these men, the white ones, and even the Black ones, were created under a cultural system that promotes racism. And some of them were facing that daily. They sometimes don't want a Black priest or a Black bishop because they would not represent the authority. Thank you very much, and sorry.